2 segments left, we got to talk about the Russian forums, right? And we have some very important material. This was the U.S.-Russia Forum. It's actually called the World U.S.-Russia Forum, advancing a constructive agenda for U.S.-Russian relations. The current crisis in Ukraine, which some see as the beginning of a new era of U.S.-Russia geopolitical confrontation, underscores the urgent need for a new foreign policy agenda that will advance both American and Russian long-term strategic interests. So this was first held in the auditorium up on the 9th floor of the Hart Senate Office Building here in Washington, and the second day started at the National Press Club. There was a reception at the Russian Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, and then the second day afternoon at the Russian Cultural Center on Phelps Place, which is a very interesting operation in its own right. Now, as you know, we proceed from warm support for Putin, but at the same time, free tactically to make important suggestions, let us say, and in particular Glaziev. Let's just go through some of the stuff. Interesting speech from Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador. Let me just state that in the entire 2 days, the constant note from the Russian representatives is that the Ukrainian military operation, the so-called anti-terrorism operation, must end. The killing of civilians and others in southeastern Ukraine by the Ukrainian military and by the so-called National Guard. In other words, the fascists of Pravi Sector, who have been officialized into the National Guard. This has got to end. This must end. And otherwise, hold on to your hat. Right? It's either end that or else. And it came from everybody on the Russian side. And I think this is legitimate. And we got to remember, right, the U.S. Arms Export Act says you can't contribute anything to governments that kill their own people. Well, the Kiev fascist clique certainly does that. Kislyak also characteristically, he says, look, there is no Cold War. There is no ideological conflict between the United States and Russia. He says Russia is a normal market economy. Well, maybe this is not exactly a source of strength. My recommendation would be that instead of simply coming on the scene as a normal market economy, Russia should assert some key parts of its own past. You can call it the Russian system, right? In the 19th century, we had the American system of protectionism and dirigism. We had the German system of protectionism and dirigism. And the Union, of course, was Friedrich List. And then we had the Russian system of protectionism and dirigism, which was to some degree inspired by Bismarck, to some degree inspired by Cassius Clay, and so forth. But it was the Russian system, and Russia did quite well under that. And the British, of course, were apoplectic because they wanted free trade and universal economic backwardness. So I would say it would be good to acquire an ideological dimension. You're going to acquire one anyway, and it ought to be this one, because if you try to acquire the ideological dimension in social policy, that may not be so good. All right. So, interesting from Kislyak. Russia is the third closest neighbor to the United States. The closest, of course, Mexico, Canada, common border. Russia, number 3, 2 to 3 miles away, up there in Alaska, where you can see Russia from your house, as everybody pointed out. Certainly this Magnitsky Act, this meddling, all this stuff with Politkovskaya, and Magnitsky, this nonsense must end. This simply creates ill will, and it is meddling. It's outrageous. All right, so let's then point out, I think one of the important speakers is Professor Stephen Cohen, Russian expert, Princeton, NYU. You'll remember I criticized his pro-Bukharin point of view going back to the 1980s, But now we have an important common task, which is to organize a resistance against a new Cold War. So Stephen Cohen was there with his wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, the owner of The Nation, influential leader of the left liberal faction in New York. And what Cohen had to say was that he wanted to put it in dramatic terms, and I think he's correct, that this is now the worst climate between the United States and Russia since 1962. Cohen believes that the new Cold War is already there, and among the alternatives, he says it could be that Ukraine is carved up successfully, or other forms of salutary neglect. But what he sees is the immediate danger of tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine. I've been saying this since 2004. It's the most dangerous real estate in the world. Polish NATO troops coming in from one side, Russian troops coming in on the other side. Russia has nuclear weapons. Polish troops can call on the NATO umbrella, and you have nuclear World War III. This must be avoided. The damn fascist clique in Kiev is not worth World War III. That's the bottom line. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, the speech by Stephen Cohen at the Hart Senate Office Building, danger of the use of tactical nuclear weapons in this crisis. I would take that absolutely seriously. And then he goes on to say the foes, the opponents of a new Cold War, which has somehow been, declared, proclaimed with an ukaz. We never got to vote on it. The elite seems to be united in a raving anti-Putin fit is what he's pointing to. But he says the foes of the new Cold War are few and they are isolated. And he complains, of course, that he personally, Cohen, has been attacked and slandered. I would frankly not give too much time to this if I were Cohen, right? I would spend more time on what should be done, right? Что делать? I think, as he pointed out at one point, right? The famous question: what should be done? He talked about the fact that during the Cold War there was the U.S. Committee for East-West Accord, and that was backed up by people like Donald Kendall of PepsiCo and Watson of IBM and others. But today the opposition is isolated, and you just don't have that muscle behind it. So he recommended that what we need is heresy against the emerging orthodoxy of new Cold War and confrontation. We also then had Ambassador Matlock, who had been Reagan's ambassador, kind of a State Department, guy from the Reagan administration. He's also quite reasonable, and he doesn't think there's a Cold War. I asked him, do you think we're in July 1914? He does not think we are. His big thing was, if you go to, Idaho or Iowa, nobody knows anything about what's happening with Russia, and therefore there's not going to be a big confrontation. Unfortunately, 1914 shows that what the little people know or don't know is not relevant all the time. Now, so I think those were significant. Now, in the afternoon session, I asked these people. This was a different panel now, right? The morning panel was Cohen, Lev Gold, the former head of the Harriman Institute, and others. Then in the afternoon, we had Matlock. We had a guy called Leonid Gozman, Gozman, and this is the Union of Right Forces. This is the voice of Boris Nemtsov, extreme neoliberal, looting economist, and Wayne Merry, former State Department and Pentagon official. Gozman, one of the Russians there on the first day, called for the military defeat of Russia. He said he wants the Ukrainians to militarily defeat Putin. And he said he opposed the annexation of Crimea, but represents 1% of Russian opinion. But nevertheless, there he was, the Union of Right Forces, Soyuz Pravich Sil, that's Guzman and Mary. Now, what I wanted, of course, was to ask about Glaziev. What do you think about Glaziev proposing exchange controls, capital controls, taking over the central bank, using the central bank to issue long-term low-interest credit for trade, infrastructure, industry, agriculture, mining, scientific research, and so forth, if the West pulls away their financing? One of the things that came out of the discussion was you can get loans from Russian banks, but it's going to be 15 to 20% interest. If you want to get a decent rate, you've got to go to a Western bank operating in Russia, and there you don't know what's going to happen. So there's a lot of stagnation creeping in. Now, this obviously where the Glaziev proposals ought to occur. Let me then record what Guzman said. Guzman repeated, this is the Nemtsov guy, Glaziev is crazy, Glaziev is crazy, Glaziev is crazy. Wayne Mary said that he wishes ardently for the victory of the Kudrin neoliberal faction over Glaziev. So I was able to get a rise out of these guys, and what they showed was a venom against Glaziev was at least as much as their venom against Putin, which was, of course, considerable. So that was, I think, an important moment. Now, the second day at the National Press Club, this is also quite interesting, a teleconference, in other words, a closed-circuit television hookup between the National Press Club and Moscow. And here we had Sergei Mironov, the head of the political party, which is sometimes translated as Fair Russia, Just Russia. What it means is equitable Russia. Maybe we can call it that, because it doesn't mean just Russia and nobody else, and it doesn't mean fair in the sense of, pretty, but equitable. Okay, so Mironov was there. Sergei Stepashin, former prime minister of Russia. Lieutenant General Yevgeny Brzezinski, International Cooperation Department, Ministry of Defense, retired. Vladimir Lukin was the Russian ambassador here in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s. Fyodor Lukyanov, important writer, Russia in Global Affairs. So that was the panel. So there was a back and forth between Washington and Moscow on that. And one of the interesting things from Mironov was there are no important problems in the world that can be solved without the agreement of the United States and Russia. I think this is exactly right. And that would be the basis in a rational political environment for a condominium. That is, the United States and Russia agree to maintain stable conditions and put the brakes on and dissuade aggressive moves. In other words, tell the Israelis and the Palestinians, here's the solution, you take it. Tell China, Japan, these rocks will not blow up the world, so be informed. And on. And then Saudi Arabia, the two, Russia, Moscow and Washington, tell Saudi Arabia, stop supporting these killers, and so on down the line. And this is what you see. This is the inherent dynamic of the world against which these lunatics in the State Department and British Foreign Office are striving. So this was also a very interesting thing.